Welcome to Lesson 6. It's time to discuss a brighter future. And we first need to start by digging into this word vortex, because it's the force that runs everything in our system. So here's a good example of a vortex. It's a satellite image of Hurricane Katrina, and this overlay shows the forces operating within it. Energy from the outer bands gets sucked into the center to fuel the storm, and that spiral sucking power is a vortex. It's an example of a centripetal force. So a hurricane is basically a breakdown in the equilibrium of the atmosphere, as centripetal forces pulling to the center completely overwhelm centrifugal forces pushing out. Normally, these forces are in balance in nature. Earth itself is a good example of this, where gravity is a centripetal force constantly pushing inward on the Earth, but Earth's rotation provides a powerful centrifugal force which keeps it from collapsing. So Earth has a good balance between centripetal and centrifugal forces, and a vortex is a breakdown in this balance. It's a temporary state of disequilibrium where centripetal forces overwhelm centrifugal. Now, why in the world am I talking about this? Because it's precisely the math of our debt-based monetary system. It's the math of the bond market and the banking system which creates all money. They create it by putting everything else in debt. Every single dollar in our system comes from debt, so it's always being pulled back to the center. Every dollar is tied at the hip to the central banking cartel. And think about that. Think about the power this group of people at the center has. They control every dollar. This is again why what I discussed in Lesson 5 is not a fake conspiracy theory, because no group in history has ever had this kind of power. Everything and everybody is hostage to it. Governments are dwarfed by it and are currently being sucked into the vortex, with Greece being the most obvious example. And the power of this storm even transcends time. For every dollar in the system, a dollar plus interest is being sucked back to the financiers at the center. But of course, the money to pay the interest doesn't exist yet, so there's a time dimension to the vortex. The money we get from banks is notional money called credit, which gets created by sucking it from the future. And elite banks drive the growth and power of the vortex, and the Fed is their mechanism for establishing this one superpower vortex with no competition. The Fed accommodates the cartel banks whenever necessary by maintaining the low pressure in the center so they can keep sucking in outer band energy with debt. And this is a way better definition of inflation than you'll ever get from economics. Prices have little to do with microeconomic supply and demand when this macro vortex is driving everything. Nor do simplistic versions of the quantity theory of money from 50 years ago explain inflation. And inflation has almost nothing to do with government printing money, which no longer occurs in this system. True inflation, credit inflation, that drives this vortex is caused by the private sector cartel at the center. Government is just a willing accomplice. And to understand this better, we would need to go back to this issue of time. As using the vortex diagram in a different way, we could plot time from 0 at the center to 30-year bonds on the edge, and what's called the yield curve would illustrate the relative air pressure across the vortex, which drives its sucking power and growth dynamics. It's precisely the same as air pressure curves in a hurricane. But I'll have to do this in a future video. The bottom line now is that as long as people are willing to borrow more, the private cartel keeps the vortex inflating. We were probably a Cat 1 or 2 hurricane when the system would have deflated in the late 80s without Fed and Treasury intervention. Then we were probably a Cat 3 back in 97 when long-term capital management was saved. Then a Cat 4 as the tech bubble burst. And then Greenspan kept us on course toward Cat 5 by lowering the central pressure of the storm even more. So we're now at the Cat 5 point. The system can't grow anymore. And that's going to be catastrophic for those of us caught in the outer bands. Of course, it wasn't really just Greenspan, but actually the greater cartel operating in collusion behind the scenes of the New York Fed and the Council on Foreign Relations, which of course also controls the U.S. Treasury. They run the vortex. So, what if we want to change this dynamic? What would be a centrifugal force that could balance the centripetal vortex forces? Well, the sucking power of the vortex comes from debt-based money, so the opposing force would be sovereign money. Money that's not sucked from the future. Money that's not attached to increasing interest payments. Money that these guys and the people that work for them on Wall Street can't get their hands on because it's in your hands. It's not electronic digits sitting in their hands for their own leveraging and profit purposes. Sovereign money doesn't depend on the decisions of the Fed. It can't be sucked to the center of the vortex. In fact, sovereign money only becomes more valuable as these guys crank up the storm. But the problem is that sovereign money has been taken from the people since the bankers took over the U.S. Treasury to make everyone dependent on the vortex. And this needs to be reversed. Ladies and gentlemen, nothing matters more to our lives and our freedom right now than making this issue happen. It's happened before. Greenbacks under Lincoln weren't governed by the vortex. Gold and silver coins held by the people aren't governed by it. And silver certificates under JFK weren't either. Now, by the way, since I'm showing gold here, this is very different from a gold standard where the banks have the gold. Those advocating a return to that type of gold standard we've seen in the past don't seem to realize it was a similar debt-based vortex where bankers collected gold and pumped out debt paper to the people. It's what led to the system we have today. A system without money, free of the vortex. Does this look like freedom? This is the key dynamic to break. All the other talk about inflation and government deficits, gold standards and taxes and whatever else, it's all missing the mark. And it's useful to flip this diagram on its side to see the hurricane vortex from a different perspective. As energy from the outer bands is sucked toward the center, it's forced upward, so the storm builds into a vertical pyramid. These are the Hamiltonian vertical forces addressed in earlier lessons. They're driven by debt. Again, debt's a sucking vortex force. So the higher up the force is, the higher the storm will be. Basically, driving more leverage into the system pulls the storm higher. So as we shifted from base money to M1 checking and savings accounts long ago, the storm grew in intensity. Then the system continued increasing leverage into M2 and M3. And then into crazy new forms of leverage like derivatives. And that was the real purpose of derivatives. It was a new, higher form of sucking power the financial system used to push us from the Cat 4 hurricane we were in that started to deflate 10 to 12 years ago to a full-blown Cat 5. And the institutions with the most derivatives have the highest sucking power, and therefore the most control over the system. So that's why JP Morgan Chase basically runs the show. Given their absurd derivatives position, they have the highest claim on capital, and they sit at the highest level of the storm. So we're living in a vortex governed by JP Morgan and the Fed cartel banks, not in a republic governed by our elected leaders. Yet Chase has the gall to put out a debt card called Chase Freedom, straight out of Orwell's 1984. And by the way, as you probably noticed already, the vortex is actually in the Chase logo. Most of the people in the bank don't have a clue what they're doing, but the people who control the bank behind the scenes know exactly how it works. And in today's economy, most of the activity in the storm is just happening up here in the Wall Street casino with the money pushers, not down in the outer bands of the real economy where the money users are scrambling. There isn't much left for the vortex to suck in to keep fueling the storm's growth. And I actually think it's going to result in massive deflation. My guess is we'll see the storm deflate back to a Cat 1, which will be catastrophic for the outer bands, i.e. most of the population. The kickoff for that will be the run on the dollar, at which point my guess is the Fed won't hesitate to jack up short rates to defend its portfolio, which effectively raises the pressure at the center of the hurricane and deflates it. Deflation maintains centripetal power, whereas it evaporates in hyperinflation, which would be like the hurricane slamming ashore and chaotically breaking up. I don't think that will be allowed, but it's actually a possibility now that they're dumping every piece of crap on the Fed's balance sheet. They may be preparing to hyperinflate it away now that the potential for the next centripetal vortex has been built in Asia. But I think they'd prefer to deflate to a steady state vortex like they've pulled off in Japan for 20 years. Time will tell. Anyway, this perspective on the storm is precisely the pyramid structure we've been discussing since Lesson 1. The masses are at the bottom in the outer bands, corporations are a key part of the upper storm, and banks sit at the top inside the eye, sucking everything else in the system toward themselves. As long as the storm is growing in strength during inflation, people on the outer bands feel like they're making progress and getting richer and having some fun in the energy of the whole thing. But once the storm runs aground or starts deflating, the truth is revealed. We were just caught in an unsustainable vortex fueled by sucking value from us as we create it, which is why a few people through history warned about this issue. This is just a sampling of the names, and I don't know, maybe you've heard of these people? But instead, we've chosen to listen to names like these. I think it's a big mistake listening to a few Harvard corporate suits compared to some of the most admired people in history who are generally known for timeless principles and trying to stand for humanity, while the Ivy Leaguers here are just pursuing power and paychecks. They're salesmen, working for the elites behind the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, I think it's safe to say we chose the wrong people to listen to.